Welcome, dear listeners, to the English Globe, a channel created especially for people who want to improve their English listening, vocabulary, and overall understanding by exploring real-world topics in a calm, clear, and educational way. And in today's episode, we will be using an important international news question as a learning tool, not to tell anyone what to think or which side to support, but to help English learners practice understanding complex ideas through structured sentences, formal vocabulary, and slow explanations that make global discussions easier to follow and more useful for long-term language development.
As you listen today, we kindly encourage you to remember that the main goal of this podcast is learning English through context, because when learners hear real topics discussed in a neutral and respectful way, they naturally become better at recognizing sentence patterns, understanding meaning from tone, and learning how ideas are connected. And this is why international relations, diplomacy, and global news are often used in advanced English learning, since they include carefully chosen words, balanced expressions, and thoughtful explanations that help listeners improve both comprehension and confidence.
The topic we will explore in this episode is a widely discussed question in international news, which is whether the United States and Israel support regime change in Iran. And this question appears often in headlines, political discussions, and global analysis, making it a useful subject for English learners who want to understand how such ideas are presented in formal language, how uncertainty is expressed through careful wording, and how journalists and analysts describe sensitive topics without making direct claims or emotional arguments.
For learners, this topic is important not because of politics, but because it introduces useful vocabulary such as government, diplomacy, foreign policy, international relations, and public statements, which are words commonly used in news reports and formal conversations. And by listening carefully to how these words are used in full sentences, learners can better understand how English speakers explain complicated ideas slowly, respectfully, and clearly, even when the topic itself may seem difficult at first.
Throughout this episode, our focus will remain on language learning, meaning that we will explain key terms in simple English, repeat important ideas using different words, and avoid strong or emotional language so that listeners can focus on understanding structure, meaning, and pronunciation, rather than feeling pressured to agree or disagree, because learning a language works best when the mind is calm, curious, and open to understanding how ideas are communicated.
Before we continue further, we would like to kindly ask you to support the English Globe by liking this video and subscribing to the channel, because your support helps us continue creating long, detailed, and learner-friendly content designed especially for people who want to improve their English through listening. And if you enjoy learning through real-world topics, your engagement makes a real difference in helping this educational content reach more learners around the world.
We would also love to hear from you in the comments, so please tell us where you are listening from, which country or city you are in, and feel free to share your thoughts about today's topic in a respectful and thoughtful way, not to debate or argue, but to practice expressing ideas in English, because writing short comments is another excellent way to improve language skills while connecting with a global community of learners.
As you continue listening, try to focus on understanding the main ideas rather than every single word. Notice how sentences are built, how opinions are avoided through neutral language, and how complex topics can be explained simply, because this approach will help you improve your English naturally over time, especially if you listen regularly and stay patient with your progress.
To help English learners understand today's topic more clearly, it is important to first describe how Iran's political system works in simple and neutral terms, because when people hear words like government, leadership, or elections in international news, they often feel confused due to unfamiliar structures, and for language learners especially, understanding the basic system helps them follow news reports more easily, recognize cause and effect relationships, and understand why different countries respond to Iran in certain ways without needing to agree or disagree with any position.
Yes, and to make this easier for listeners, we will explain these ideas slowly and carefully, using simple vocabulary and repeated explanations, because Iran's political system includes institutions and roles that may sound unfamiliar at first, and when learners hear these words many times in slightly different ways, they can better remember the meaning, improve listening comprehension, and feel more confident when these terms appear again in future news stories or conversations.
In very simple terms, Iran is officially known as an Islamic republic, which means its political system combines elements of religious leadership with elected government institutions, and this structure was established after the 1979 revolution, creating a system where some leaders are chosen through public elections, while others hold positions based on religious authority. And understanding this combination is essential for learners who want to follow discussions about power, decision-making, and responsibility within the country.
So, when Adam says a combination, he means that Iran does not function in the same way as countries where all leaders are elected by voters. And it also does not work like a system where only religious figures control everything. But instead, power is shared between elected officials and religious institutions, which can sometimes create complex relationships that are discussed carefully in international media, using formal and indirect language.
One of the most important terms learners often hear is supreme leader, which refers to the highest authority in Iran's political system, and this position holds significant influence over major institutions such as the military, judiciary, and state media, meaning that decisions in these areas are often connected to the supreme leader's guidance, and this is why international analysts frequently mention this role when explaining how long-term policies are shaped inside the country.
To say this in simpler words, the supreme leader is not elected by the public in regular elections like a president, but is chosen by a religious body. And once selected, this leader has long-term authority, which explains why news reports often describe the position as powerful and stable, using words like influence, oversight, and direction, rather than emotional or dramatic expressions.
Alongside this role, Iran also has a president who is elected by citizens through national elections, and the president is responsible for managing the government, handling economic policies, and representing the country in diplomatic discussions, although the president's authority operates within limits defined by the broader political system, which means that some decisions require cooperation with other institutions.
In other words, elections do exist in Iran, and people do participate in voting. But the impact of elections works differently compared to some other political systems. And this is why English learners often hear phrases like limited authority or shared power when reading or listening to international explanations about Iranian politics.
To give listeners a clearer picture, we recently asked a university lecturer who specializes in Middle Eastern studies to describe what an ordinary political scene in Iran might look like, such as during an election period, and the lecturer explained that people may see campaign posters, televised debates, and public discussions, while at the same time knowing that certain institutions remain unchanged regardless of election results, which helps explain how continuity and change exist together in the system.
What is interesting for language learners is how this lecturer described the scene using careful language, focusing on observation rather than judgment, and using phrases like, "it appears." It is structured in a way that, and it operates within a defined framework, which are expressions commonly used in academic and journalistic English to describe political systems without expressing personal opinions.
Another important institution learners should understand is the Guardian Council, which plays a role in reviewing laws and approving candidates for elections, and this body acts as a gatekeeper within the system, meaning it influences who can participate in political competition. And when learners hear discussions about elections in Iran, this institution is often mentioned as part of the explanation for how the process is organized.
To simplify this, the Guardian Council helps decide which laws match the country's legal and religious framework, and which candidates are allowed to run for office. So when learners hear that not all candidates can participate, this decision comes from institutions designed to maintain the system's structure rather than from individual voters.
By understanding how these different parts work together, learners can better follow international discussions that describe cause and effect, such as how institutional design influences political outcomes or how leadership structure affects foreign policy decisions. And this understanding allows listeners to focus on language patterns instead of feeling lost in unfamiliar details.
Exactly. And for English learners, the most important skill here is not memorizing political facts, but learning how explanations are formed, how neutral tone is maintained, and how complex ideas are broken into clear steps. Because these skills apply not only to political topics, but also to academic studies, professional discussions, and advanced listening situations.
As we continue this episode, listeners should try to notice how sentences explain relationships between roles, institutions, and decisions, since this cause and effect structure is very common in English news reporting, and recognizing it will help learners improve both understanding and confidence when listening to long-form educational content.
And by approaching this topic calmly and patiently, learners can improve their English while gaining a clearer picture of how political systems are described in global conversations, without needing to take sides, form strong opinions, or feel overwhelmed by unfamiliar terminology.
In international relations, the term regime change is an abstract expression used by academics, analysts, and journalists to describe a situation where a country's system of governance is replaced by another system through internal or external pressure. And historically, this term has been discussed in textbooks, policy papers, and diplomatic language as a concept rather than an action, meaning that when English learners hear it in the news, it is important to understand that it often refers to long-term political change discussed at a theoretical level rather than a direct or immediate event.
For English learners, it is useful to focus on the pronunciation and meaning of abstract nouns like regime, policy, influence, and transition, because these words do not describe physical objects, but ideas, and they are commonly used in serious discussions where emotional language is avoided, which helps listeners recognize that the speaker is explaining a concept calmly rather than trying to persuade or provoke a reaction.
From an academic perspective, regime change has been used to describe many historical situations in different regions of the world, and scholars usually analyze it by looking at causes, processes, and outcomes over long periods of time, which is why the term often appears alongside passive voice structures such as was influenced, was shaped, or was affected, allowing the speaker to focus on processes instead of assigning direct responsibility to specific actors.
When listening carefully, learners may notice that neutral explanations often rely on passive constructions and careful wording, because this style allows complex political developments to be discussed without emotional judgment, and recognizing this difference helps learners understand why formal English sounds distant or indirect, especially when compared to everyday conversational language.
In media and diplomatic communication, the term regime change is frequently used in a descriptive or analytical way rather than as a stated goal, which means that headlines, reports, and official briefings may mention it as a possibility, a concern, or a topic of debate, while clearly separating what is officially stated by governments from how journalists, analysts, or commentators interpret those statements.
This distinction is very important for English learners, because official policy usually refers to written documents, formal speeches, or public announcements, while interpretations are explanations offered by observers who analyze tone, context, and historical patterns. And understanding this difference helps learners avoid confusing facts with opinions when listening to international news.
For example, when a government issues a statement using formal language about supporting stability, dialogue, or diplomacy, This does not automatically mean that regime change is being promoted, but in media discussions, analysts may debate what such language could imply based on past experiences, regional dynamics, or strategic interests, and this separation between what is said and how it is interpreted is central to understanding international communication.
Learners should pay attention to words like suggests, indicates, is interpreted as, or has been viewed by some observers, because these phrases signal interpretation rather than confirmed policy, and recognizing these signals helps listeners maintain a neutral understanding instead of reacting emotionally to strong or simplified headlines.
Historically, the discussion of regime change has evolved as international law, diplomacy, and global institutions have developed, and modern discourse often emphasizes sovereignty, negotiation, and international norms, which is why contemporary explanations tend to be cautious, layered, and carefully phrased, especially in educational or academic settings where balance and accuracy are valued.
From a language learning perspective, this careful phrasing is helpful because it exposes learners to advanced sentence structures, abstract vocabulary, and formal tone, allowing them to practice understanding long explanations that do not rely on emotional language, but instead focus on clarity, context, and precision.
By learning how the term regime change is used academically and diplomatically, listeners can improve their ability to follow complex discussions without misunderstanding intent. And this skill is especially valuable when consuming English language news, lectures, or policy analysis, where meaning is often implied through structure and vocabulary, rather than stated directly.
Ultimately, the goal for learners is not to memorize political positions, but to recognize how neutral English functions in serious discussions, how abstract nouns carry meaning, and how passive voice allows speakers to explain sensitive topics carefully, which strengthens both listening comprehension and critical understanding over time.
When discussing U.S. policy toward Iran in an educational and neutral way, it is important for English learners to understand that this policy is usually communicated through officially stated tools such as public announcements, written policy documents, press briefings, and diplomatic language, rather than through emotional or informal expressions. And these tools often include sanctions, negotiations, and diplomatic engagement, which are described carefully in formal English so that meaning is precise, measured, and clearly separated from personal opinion or media interpretation.
To make Adam's explanation easier to understand, learners should notice that US policy is not expressed through one single action, but through a combination of carefully announced steps, where verbs like stated, announced, confirmed, and emphasized are commonly used. And these reporting verbs help listeners recognize when information is coming directly from an official source rather than from journalists, commentators, or analysts who may add their own interpretation to the discussion.
In formal international communication, sanctions are often described as economic or diplomatic measures that are officially announced by government departments, and these announcements usually explain the purpose, scope, and legal basis of such measures using structured sentences and passive voice, which allows the focus to remain on policy objectives rather than individuals, making it easier for English learners to follow the explanation without being distracted by emotional or dramatic wording.
For learners, it is helpful to understand that when news reports say sanctions were imposed, sanctions were expanded, or sanctions were lifted, the passive voice is being used to maintain a formal tone and avoid assigning emotional blame, and recognizing this structure helps listeners understand that the report is describing an official action rather than expressing approval or criticism.
Another important tool used in U.S. policy toward Iran is diplomacy, which refers to communication through meetings, negotiations, and official dialogue. And this is often reported using cautious phrases such as talks were held, discussions were announced, or negotiations were described as ongoing, which signals to the listener that the information is based on publicly available statements rather than private intentions or speculative analysis.
This kind of careful wording is especially important for English learners because it shows how formal news language avoids strong claims and instead relies on verbs like noted, indicated, or acknowledged, which suggests that information is being reported responsibly without drawing conclusions that go beyond what has been officially communicated.
Negotiations related to Iran are often discussed in connection with international agreements, and when U.S. officials speak about these topics, they usually emphasize positions using phrases like, "the administration stated its commitment," "officials announced their position," or "representatives confirmed ongoing efforts," which helps separate what is formally declared from what outside observers might speculate about future intentions.
Learners should pay close attention to these reporting verbs because they function as signals in news-style English, clearly indicating whether a sentence is describing an official position, summarizing a statement, or referencing a documented policy. And this skill helps listeners avoid confusion when different media sources present the same topic using slightly different language.
Speculation, which often appears in opinion articles or commentary programs, is usually marked by different language choices, such as analysts believe, observers suggest, or commentators argue, and understanding this distinction allows English learners to recognize that these statements are interpretations rather than confirmed policy, which is essential when listening to international news calmly and critically.
By comparing officially announced language with speculative language, learners can begin to understand how formal English maintains neutrality, and how careful verb choice protects the speaker from overstating facts, which is why educational discussions like this one focus on explaining how language works instead of encouraging agreement or disagreement with any political position.
Overall, U.S. policy toward Iran, when viewed through official statements and public actions, is best understood as a series of formally communicated decisions expressed through structured language, reporting verbs, and passive constructions. And this approach provides English learners with an excellent opportunity to practice listening to long explanations while developing the ability to separate confirmed information from interpretation.
For language learners, the real value of this discussion lies in understanding how serious topics are communicated in formal English, how verbs shape meaning, and how neutral tone supports clarity. Because mastering these elements improves comprehension, not only for political news, but also for academic lectures, professional environments, and advanced listening situations.
When international news reports mention that a country or organization is being targeted in politics, this word is often used in a broad sense to describe actions such as sanctions, legal charges, travel restrictions, or other formal measures announced by governments, and for English learners it is important to understand that targeting does not necessarily imply military action or direct physical confrontation, but instead refers to a variety of diplomatic and economic tools that are officially communicated to achieve specific objectives, which allows journalists to summarize complex policies in a single powerful term that can sometimes be misleading if interpreted literally.
To make this easier for listeners, it helps to think of targeting as a formal word that bundles multiple measures, and when we hear phrases like targeted sanctions or targeted restrictions, it usually means the government has officially announced limitations on trade, finances, or travel without implying immediate danger or violence, and by recognizing these words as abstract political vocabulary, learners can improve their comprehension while also learning to identify subtle differences between literal and figurative usage in news reporting.
Sanctions are one of the most common measures associated with targeting, and these are usually described in formal language as economic penalties imposed to influence behavior, which may include restricting access to financial markets, banning certain exports, or freezing assets. And when these actions are officially stated by government offices or international bodies, they are framed in a neutral and legal context, which means that learners should pay attention to verbs like announced, imposed, enacted, or implemented, since these verbs indicate formal, factual actions rather than emotional or dramatic interventions.
It is also important for learners to understand that legal charges or indictments are another form of targeting. And in these cases, governments or courts publicly announce accusations, investigations, or prosecutions, which are often reported using verbs like filed, charged, or accused. And by paying attention to these reporting verbs, listeners can distinguish between official legal processes and speculative commentary that might appear in opinion pieces or casual conversation.
Travel restrictions are a further example, and these are measures announced by governments or international organizations to prevent or limit movement for specific individuals, groups, or entities, often communicated formally using expressions such as barred, restricted, or prohibited. And understanding these terms allows learners to see that the word targeting in news headlines often condenses multiple distinct legal and diplomatic measures into a single expression that sounds stronger than the actual action, which is why careful reading and listening are essential skills for English learners.
Many learners are confused because headlines frequently use targeting in a dramatic way, such as Country X targeted by powerful measures, which can imply military intervention to someone unfamiliar with political vocabulary. But by breaking the sentence into components and understanding the verbs and nouns used, listeners can see that it often refers to sanctions, travel restrictions, or legal steps, rather than physical attack. And this critical reading approach is a valuable skill for learners who want to interpret news accurately.
It is also useful to note that military action, when it occurs, is usually described very explicitly in official statements or media reporting with verbs like launched, struck, or attacked, which are rarely combined with targeting in neutral diplomatic contexts, meaning that when English learners hear targeting in an article, the safest assumption is that it refers to economic, legal, or diplomatic pressure unless other clear military terms are included.
To help learners retain this knowledge, it is useful to practice paraphrasing. For example, a headline that says, "Sanctions target country Y," can be rephrased as, "The government announced sanctions that apply to country Y," which keeps the meaning precise, removes any dramatic connotation, and illustrates how formal English expresses complex political actions in a calm, structured, and easily understandable way for educational purposes.
By examining examples from news outlets that carefully report sanctions, legal actions, or travel restrictions, learners can recognize patterns of reporting verbs, nouns, and passive voice constructions, which allows them to distinguish between factual reporting and opinion, understand the range of actions implied by targeting, and practice critical listening skills that are essential for interpreting advanced English content in academic, professional, and everyday contexts.
In conclusion, understanding targeting in international politics helps learners build vocabulary, identify the subtle differences between economic, legal, and military actions, recognize formal reporting verbs, and develop the habit of reading and listening to news critically, because mastering these skills not only improves English comprehension, but also enables learners to approach complex topics with confidence and clarity, avoiding misunderstandings caused by dramatic or simplified language in headlines or casual commentary.
When English learners read or listen to international news, it is crucial to understand that the way media outlets present information, often called media narratives, can differ significantly from the content of official policy documents, statements, or press releases, because media reports are designed to summarize complex developments, attract attention, and fit within headline constraints, whereas official policy texts are usually longer, carefully worded, and focused on legal and diplomatic precision. And by analyzing these differences, learners can practice distinguishing between what governments officially state and how journalists interpret or frame these statements for public audiences, which is an essential skill for advanced comprehension and critical listening.
For learners, it is helpful to notice that opinion and analysis often appear alongside factual reporting in news articles, which means that sentences containing verbs such as suggest, argue, or claim usually indicate that the statement represents interpretation rather than confirmed policy, whereas verbs like stated, announced, or confirmed point to official sources. And by comparing these verbs within a single article, learners can begin to see patterns in reporting that help differentiate between observation, speculation, and fact, which improves both comprehension and critical evaluation of English language news.
Headlines are another area where learners should pay attention because they are often written to summarize complex information in a short, striking way, which can lead to simplification, exaggeration, or omission of details. And this means that a headline saying a country is targeted or under pressure may compress multiple diplomatic, legal, and economic actions into one dramatic phrase, whereas the accompanying official documents or statements usually specify exactly which measures are being taken, by whom, and under what legal or procedural authority, allowing learners to understand the nuance behind the media language.
To illustrate this, learners can look at how a single news article may include a headline, a summary paragraph, and quotes from government officials or experts. And within this structure, some sentences express direct policy using reporting verbs like stated, emphasized, or clarified, while others express opinion or analysis using verbs like argued, suggested, or interpreted. And by identifying these differences, learners develop skills in analytical reading, noticing subtle shifts in tone, and understanding how formal English functions to convey both facts and viewpoints.
It is also valuable to explain that media narratives are influenced by multiple factors, including editorial policies, audience expectations, and space limitations, which can lead to framing that emphasizes certain aspects of an event over others. And for English learners, this is an opportunity to practice comparative language, because they can learn to contrast how the media frames a story with the careful wording of an official statement, noting which elements are highlighted, omitted, or interpreted differently, which reinforces cause and effect thinking and enhances comprehension of complex sentence structures.
For example, if an article reports that sanctions hit a country, learners should recognize that the word hit is dramatic, suggesting impact or aggression, whereas an official statement might say sanctions were implemented or announced, which is neutral, formal, and precise. And by comparing these two expressions, listeners can understand how metaphorical or figurative language in media can differ from literal, formal language used in policy documents, which is a critical lesson for developing advanced English listening and reading skills.
Another point for learners is that journalists often summarize multiple sources into a single narrative, which means that they may combine statements from government officials, analysts, and international organizations into one article, using phrases like according to analysts, some experts suggest, or officials claim, which are all reporting structures that signal interpretation rather than direct fact. And learners who pay attention to these phrases can improve their ability to separate subjective commentary from objective reporting, which is essential for understanding English used in global news contexts.
It is important to also highlight the way comparisons are expressed in news reporting, because articles frequently compare past and present actions, domestic versus international positions, or different countries' responses, using language such as in contrast, compared with, whereas or unlike, which allows listeners to follow analytical reasoning, recognize relationships between events, and understand how journalists construct logical connections, which is very valuable for English learners who want to strengthen comprehension and critical thinking simultaneously.
Learners should also pay attention to how hedging language is used in journalism to maintain neutrality. For example, phrases like, "it appears that," "it is reported that," or "may indicate that," which signal that the author is summarizing information without asserting certainty, and by noticing these patterns, learners can understand how formal English conveys caution, subtlety, and objectivity, and how these features differ from casual speech, which often relies on direct statements and strong personal opinions.
Another technique learners can practice is identifying key nouns that indicate the type of information being presented, such as statement, announcement, report, briefing, or press release, which signal that the sentence contains officially documented information, while nouns like commentary, analysis, interpretation, or opinion indicate that the sentence contains subjective evaluation. And by noticing this, learners can read more critically and understand not only what is being said, but also what type of information is being communicated.
It is also useful to point out that sentence structure can signal analytical reasoning, as journalists often use complex sentences with clauses that contrast or connect ideas, such as although, however, despite, or while, which require careful listening or reading to fully understand, and practicing these structures helps learners follow nuanced explanations, see relationships between facts and interpretations, and distinguish between different layers of meaning in formal English texts or audio reports.
For English learners, the overall lesson is that careful attention to reporting verbs, comparative structures, hedging language, and sentence complexity allows them to differentiate between official policy and media narratives, which not only strengthens their vocabulary, but also develops advanced listening skills, critical reading skills, and the ability to understand international news calmly and accurately without being misled by dramatic headlines or simplified summaries.
By practicing this skill over time, learners gain confidence in following multi-source articles, televised news segments, or press briefings, noticing subtle differences in phrasing, tone, and vocabulary, and applying analytical reasoning to interpret meaning, which helps them approach complex topics, including international relations, diplomacy, and global events, with both linguistic skill and critical understanding, which is the ultimate goal of combining English learning with educational news discussions.
In summary, understanding media narratives versus official policy provides learners with a clear framework to identify objective statements, interpret speculative commentary, recognize analytical language, and practice careful listening and reading, which are essential skills for navigating formal English. And by applying these strategies regularly, learners can enhance comprehension, improve vocabulary, and confidently approach international news in a neutral, calm, and educated way without confusion or bias.
When discussing public protests in any country, including Iran, it is important for English learners to understand that the term protest refers to organized gatherings or demonstrations in which people express their opinions, concerns, or dissatisfaction with government policies, social issues, or other matters, and journalists and diplomats often describe these events in neutral language using verbs such as stated, noted, observed, or reported, which allows listeners to understand what is happening without introducing graphic, emotional, or sensational content. And by analyzing these words, learners can improve comprehension while maintaining a respectful perspective.
For learners, it is helpful to recognize that synonyms for protest, such as demonstration, rally, march, or gathering, are often used interchangeably in formal reporting. And by hearing or reading these words in different contexts, learners can expand their vocabulary and develop a more nuanced understanding of how English describes public expression, which is essential for discussing sensitive topics in a neutral, educational manner without using emotionally charged language.
Governments and international organizations typically respond to protests using official statements that are carefully worded to express concern, call for dialogue, or emphasize the importance of order, and these statements are usually reported in indirect speech. For example, the ministry stated that authorities are monitoring developments, or international organizations emphasized the importance of peaceful dialogue, which allows English learners to understand both the response and the language used to communicate it formally and neutrally.
It is also important for learners to notice that indirect speech is widely used in news reports to convey information from official sources without quoting them directly. using phrases like "it was reported that," "officials noted that," or "representatives indicated that," which not only maintains neutrality, but also helps learners recognize sentence structures that are common in journalism, allowing them to follow discussions about protests and international reactions clearly and confidently.
When describing public demonstrations, reporters and diplomats often emphasize organization, participation, and messaging rather than focusing on individual actions or dramatic events, using phrases such as "participants gathered," "demonstrators marched peacefully," or "rallies were held in major cities," and this neutral framing allows learners to focus on vocabulary and sentence patterns, while avoiding exposure to violent, graphic, or emotionally charged content that could distract from language learning goals.
Learners should also pay attention to reporting verbs that indicate observation, concern, or official commentary, such as stated, noted, urged, or highlighted, because these verbs signal that the sentence is conveying information or guidance rather than expressing opinion or personal judgment. And by identifying these verbs in context, learners can distinguish between neutral reporting and editorial commentary, which is an essential skill for critical listening and reading in English.
International reactions to protests are also carefully phrased to maintain diplomacy, and officials may use expressions such as "called for calm," "encouraged dialogue," or emphasized the importance of peaceful expression, and these phrases demonstrate how language can communicate concern, support for rights, or caution without using sensational or emotionally charged wording, which is why analyzing the sentence structure and verb choice helps learners understand formal English in complex global situations.
Another strategy learners can use is to notice the adjectives and adverbs that accompany descriptions of protests, such as peaceful, organized, widespread, or significant, because these words provide context and scale without exaggerating events, and learning how these descriptive words are paired with neutral verbs enhances both comprehension and vocabulary, allowing learners to report or discuss sensitive topics in English, politely and accurately.
English learners should also recognize that indirect speech often conveys multiple layers of information in one sentence. For example, it was observed that participants gathered in various cities and officials emphasized dialogue, which communicates both the occurrence of events and the official response in a single, neutral construction. And by practicing this sentence structure, learners can improve understanding of complex formal English and develop advanced listening skills for international news.
Finally, by focusing on vocabulary, indirect speech, and neutral descriptive language, learners can gain confidence in understanding and discussing public protests and international reactions without using emotionally charged or sensational terms. And this approach supports careful comprehension, respectful communication, and the ability to analyze both official statements and media reports critically, which are essential skills for advanced English learners engaging with global topics in a calm, structured, and educational manner.
When discussing international relations, it is important for English learners to understand that diplomacy refers to the formal ways in which countries communicate with each other to resolve disagreements, negotiate agreements, and express positions without using force or aggressive language, and in diplomatic statements. Verbs such as emphasized, affirmed, noted, or reiterated are often used to convey careful observation, respect for sovereignty, and commitment to peaceful discussion, which allows learners to follow international conversations without being influenced by sensationalized interpretations or emotionally charged wording that sometimes appears in casual media reporting.
For learners, it is useful to notice that diplomatic language often includes indirect expressions, hedging, and formal phrases, such as "it was emphasized," that officials reiterated, or "representatives affirmed," which may seem long or complex at first. But these constructions are designed to maintain neutrality, convey respect, and avoid confrontation. And by hearing or reading these examples repeatedly, learners can internalize the structure, understand subtle meaning, and improve their ability to follow long, formal English sentences used in international discussions.
International law is another essential concept for English learners because it defines rules and agreements that countries are expected to follow, including principles of sovereignty, non-interference, and peaceful resolution of disputes. And when governments communicate their position within the framework of international law, they often use precise, careful language, such as actions are consistent with international obligations or measures are in accordance with legal frameworks, which shows learners how formal English functions to express compliance, responsibility, and caution in global diplomacy.
Simplifying this for learners, we can say that sovereignty refers to a country's right to govern itself without outside interference, and phrases like respecting sovereignty, reaffirming independence, or observing territorial integrity are commonly used in official statements, which allow learners to connect vocabulary with real-world contexts while understanding how formal English communicates disagreement or concern without escalating tension or conflict.
When countries express disagreement in international settings, they often use phrases such as expressed concern, noted differences, or called for dialogue, which indicate that a disagreement exists while maintaining a neutral and peaceful tone, and this type of language is structured carefully to avoid accusations or inflammatory statements, allowing learners to practice recognizing formal verbs, indirect constructions, and the difference between expressing policy positions and making personal judgments.
To reinforce comprehension, learners should pay attention to how sentences are often long and layered, combining multiple ideas with connectors such as although, while, despite, or however. For example, a statement may read, although differences were noted, officials emphasized the importance of continued dialogue and respect for international law, which communicates both disagreement and commitment to peaceful communication in a single structured sentence that helps learners practice advanced listening and comprehension skills.
Diplomatic communication also frequently involves repeated key terms and synonyms, for instance, referring to discussions as talks, consultations, negotiations, or dialogue, and referring to principles as obligations, rules, norms, or agreements, which provides learners with multiple ways to understand the same concept, reinforces vocabulary, and allows them to follow complex statements by recognizing repeated structures, formal verbs, and nuanced phrasing, all of which are hallmarks of professional English in international relations.
Learners should also notice how indirect speech is used to report official positions. For example, it was noted that the parties agreed to continue consultations, or representatives affirmed the need for peaceful resolution, which conveys information about both the action and the attitude of officials without quoting anyone directly. And understanding this indirect reporting structure is a key skill for interpreting formal English in diplomatic contexts, while remaining neutral and focused on language learning.
Another feature of diplomatic language is careful phrasing when addressing potential conflict, such as avoiding strong verbs like attack or threaten, and instead using phrases like expressed concern, emphasized caution, or highlighted differences, which communicates disagreement without implying aggression. And by listening for these patterns, learners can develop the ability to distinguish between formal, neutral English and casual or sensational language that may exaggerate events or create misunderstanding.
Finally, by analyzing diplomatic statements and international law language together, learners can practice following long, complex sentences, understand how abstract nouns like sovereignty, obligations, and compliance function in context, recognize formal verbs and reporting structures, and develop advanced listening skills that allow them to comprehend international discussions calmly and accurately, which is a valuable skill for anyone seeking to use English professionally, academically, or in informed conversation about global events.
Overall, the study of diplomatic language and international law provides learners with an excellent opportunity to expand vocabulary, practice long sentence comprehension, recognize formal verbs and structures, and understand how countries communicate disagreement in a respectful, neutral, and legally informed way, which strengthens both listening and critical thinking skills, enabling learners to engage with international news and discussions without confusion, misinterpretation, or unnecessary emotional reaction.
For English learners, the key takeaway is that by focusing on neutral phrasing, indirect speech, layered sentences, and formal vocabulary, they can better understand how diplomacy works, how international law is applied in everyday statements, and how careful language supports peaceful communication, which not only improves comprehension of advanced English, but also allows learners to approach sensitive global topics confidently, accurately, and respectfully.
One of the most effective ways for English learners to expand their vocabulary and improve listening comprehension is by engaging with global topics, because when learners follow discussions about world events such as international diplomacy, economic developments, or public policy, they are exposed to advanced terminology, long structured sentences, and formal reporting verbs, which not only broadens their understanding of language, but also teaches them to interpret complex ideas through context, encouraging patience and reinforcing the skill of following multi-layered explanations that are typical in formal English media and academic presentations.
For learners, one important advantage of listening to global topics is the repeated exposure to key vocabulary in different contexts, which allows the brain to link meaning with real-world examples. And by hearing terms like diplomacy, sovereignty, sanctions, and negotiations used consistently across discussions, learners can internalize formal English vocabulary, recognize patterns in sentence structures, and build the confidence needed to understand long, advanced sentences without feeling overwhelmed, which ultimately supports steady and measurable improvement over time.
When learners engage with serious topics, they also encounter varied sentence structures, including compound, complex, and layered sentences, which are often longer than conversational English. And by practicing comprehension of these structures, learners develop the ability to follow ideas across multiple clauses, recognize the relationship between cause and effect, and identify subtle differences in meaning conveyed through formal verbs, reporting phrases, and comparative expressions, which strengthens both listening and reading skills in ways that simple everyday conversations cannot fully achieve.
Another key benefit for learners is context-based reinforcement, which occurs when a new word or phrase is repeated in different situations within a discussion, such as hearing the term sanctions used in connection with diplomacy, economics, and international law, allowing learners to understand its precise meaning and nuances. And by reflecting on these repetitions, learners develop memory retention, confidence in usage, and the ability to interpret formal English accurately, which enhances overall language proficiency and encourages engagement with advanced listening materials.
Patience and consistency are essential for mastering English through global topics, because the language in international discussions often requires sustained attention to understand meaning fully, and by listening to long-form conversations between presenters or experts, learners gradually train their ear to process longer sentences, absorb abstract vocabulary, and recognize reporting verbs, indirect speech, and formal connectors, which leads to improved comprehension, better note-taking skills, and increased comfort with advanced English structures in both professional and academic contexts.
Learners also benefit from observing how speakers clarify ideas, paraphrase information, and emphasize key points in formal discussions, because this modeling shows them effective strategies for understanding complex content, and by reflecting on these techniques, learners can adopt similar strategies for their own listening practice, learning to pause, identify core meaning, and connect new vocabulary to previously learned terms, which builds both comprehension and self-confidence in approaching challenging material.
Global topics also enhance critical thinking skills in language learning because learners must analyze information, distinguish between fact and interpretation, and recognize neutral versus evaluative language. And by doing so, they are not only improving vocabulary and sentence comprehension, but also learning to think in English. which is an essential skill for fluency, as it enables learners to process ideas directly in English rather than translating mentally from their native language, thereby increasing both speed of comprehension and overall language efficiency.
Reflection-based learning is particularly effective in this context because learners who pause to consider the meaning of sentences, the function of specific verbs, and the relationship between clauses can internalize language patterns more effectively. And by practicing this type of reflective listening, learners gain a deeper understanding of how formal English is structured, how advanced vocabulary is used naturally in context, and how careful phrasing communicates nuanced ideas without oversimplifying or sensationalizing, which is critical for understanding professional English discourse.
Another motivational aspect of studying global topics is that learners can see tangible progress over time, because repeated exposure to challenging content leads to improved comprehension, increased vocabulary retention, and enhanced ability to follow multi-layered arguments, and this sense of achievement encourages persistence, builds confidence, and motivates learners to continue engaging with long-form content, which is the ultimate goal for anyone seeking fluency, advanced listening skills, and the ability to navigate serious English language materials independently.
Finally, learners should recognize that combining vocabulary acquisition, sentence comprehension, critical listening, and reflective practice through global topics is a holistic approach that simultaneously strengthens multiple language skills, encourages analytical thinking, and builds confidence in understanding real-world English. And by maintaining consistency, embracing patience, and approaching content with curiosity and attention, learners can achieve significant improvement over time, demonstrating that studying complex topics is not only valuable for comprehension, but also highly effective for long-term English mastery.
As we conclude this episode, it is valuable for English learners to reflect on the many vocabulary terms, grammatical structures, and formal sentence patterns that we have explored, including words related to international relations such as diplomacy, sovereignty, sanctions, negotiations, protests, and policy, as well as reporting verbs like stated, announced, emphasized, or reiterated. And by reviewing these elements carefully, learners can see how each term functions in context, how formal language conveys neutrality, and how understanding these structures allows them to comprehend complex ideas without being influenced by sensationalized media or emotionally charged language, which is an important skill for advanced listening practice.
For learners, it is helpful to recognize that throughout this podcast, we have consistently used indirect speech, layered sentence constructions, comparative language, and hedging phrases, all of which are common in formal English and professional reporting. And by reflecting on how these forms appear in multiple contexts, learners can improve their ability to parse long sentences, identify subject-verb relationships, understand nuanced meaning, and confidently follow multi-step explanations, which strengthens both comprehension and the ability to summarize or discuss complex information in English independently.
Another aspect that learners should notice is the emphasis on repetition and context, because hearing vocabulary and expressions used in different sections, ranging from sanctions to targeting, diplomacy to protests, helps solidify understanding, reinforce long-term memory, and develop the skill of recognizing formal structures as they occur naturally in news reports, academic discussions, or international briefings. And by practicing active listening with this awareness, learners can gradually increase their comfort with long-form English, improve their attention to detail, and build the confidence to engage with challenging topics without feeling overwhelmed.
It is also important to remember that reflective learning and careful analysis of language are key strategies, because when learners pause to consider sentence meaning, observe how verbs and nouns interact, or compare formal expressions with neutral synonyms, they are developing critical thinking skills alongside language proficiency, which allows them to not only understand English better, but also interpret information carefully distinguish between fact and interpretation, and respond to new content thoughtfully, reinforcing the educational goals of this podcast and the emphasis on learning rather than forming opinions or judgments.
We have also consistently highlighted how formal English communicates complex topics with neutrality and precision, for example, by using phrases such as "it was noted that," "officials emphasized," or "representatives affirmed." And by practicing listening to such constructions, learners develop the ability to track multiple layers of meaning in a single sentence, follow cause and effect relationships, and recognize subtleties that are often overlooked in casual conversation, which strengthens overall language skills and prepares learners to understand advanced English used in global discussions, professional contexts, and academic settings.
Learners should take note of how context, repetition, and paraphrasing reinforce comprehension, because hearing phrases such as expressed concern, emphasized dialogue, or reaffirmed commitment in multiple examples allows the brain to associate vocabulary with meaning, internalize formal structures, and gradually develop automatic understanding, which not only improves listening skills but also enhances the ability to read, summarize, and discuss complex topics accurately, giving learners the confidence to engage with serious English content in a calm and reflective manner.
Additionally, we have consistently avoided emotionally charged or sensational language, focusing instead on neutral reporting verbs, descriptive nouns, and indirect speech. And this approach helps learners understand how professional English conveys meaning responsibly, separates fact from interpretation, and allows for careful comprehension of sensitive topics, which is particularly valuable for learners who wish to use English in academic, professional, or international contexts, as it teaches not only language, but also critical evaluation and analytical listening skills that are essential for advanced proficiency.
It is also valuable for learners to reflect on the way formal connectors, comparative phrases, and layered clauses have been used throughout the podcast, because recognizing structures such as although, however, despite, while, or whereas helps learners understand relationships between ideas, track contrasts, and cause-effect reasoning, and follow complex arguments across multiple sentences, which strengthens comprehension of long-form English and provides learners with the tools to express themselves clearly and accurately in both spoken and written forms.
Finally, the overarching lesson of this podcast is that language learning is most effective when combined with meaningful content, such as global events, diplomacy, and international relations, because exposure to real-world topics provides context for vocabulary, demonstrates advanced sentence structures, and encourages critical thinking, and by approaching this material with patience, repetition, and reflective listening, learners can steadily improve their comprehension, vocabulary retention, and confidence, while remaining aware that this episode is designed purely for educational purposes, to support language learning rather than influence opinions or political beliefs.
As we conclude, we encourage all learners to continue exploring English through long-form discussions, news reports, and educational podcasts, reflecting on new vocabulary, observing formal structures, and practicing critical listening, because consistent engagement, curiosity, and careful attention to context build fluency, comprehension, and self-confidence. And by following these strategies, learners can approach complex topics with calm, focus, and clarity, knowing that every listening session contributes to steady progress and mastery of formal professional English in real-world contexts.
In summary, this episode has demonstrated the value of combining advanced vocabulary, formal sentence structures, indirect speech, reporting verbs, layered clauses, and careful analysis of global topics to support English learning. And by practicing these techniques consistently, learners are equipped to comprehend complex material, interpret news and official statements accurately, expand their vocabulary in meaningful contexts, and develop the analytical listening and reading skills that are essential for professional, academic, and everyday use of English.
We hope that learners feel encouraged to continue long-form listening, observe the subtle nuances of language, practice reflection, and build confidence through repetition, context, and critical thinking. Because the ultimate goal of this podcast is to provide a safe educational environment for mastering English, reinforcing the importance of patience, attention, and consistent practice, and leaving learners empowered to engage with challenging topics while improving both comprehension and communication in formal English.